Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the Doorstep podcast. I'm your co-host, Nicholas Gvosdev, Senior Fellow here at the Carnegie Council.
And I'm Tatiana, Serafin, co-host also here of the Doorstep, and welcoming you to 2022. Or is it 2021? I don't know. I feel like it's Groundhog year, but we're going to talk about, is it not, or is it, with Judah Grunstein, Editor-in-Chief of World Politics Review, in a minute. Did things change or did they stay the same? Are we optimistic or are we pessimistic? We'll get to hear all of us in a minute, but I wanted to mention, Nick, because I think this is a super interesting story that everybody forgot about. In October, the Pandora Papers came out talking about offshore and all the money offshore, and all of the hidden money that politicians, billionaires are hiding and using it to manipulate foreign and domestic policy, which is what we talk about here at the Doorstep, how the world impacts you. Our first book talk is January 24th, and I want to mention Casey Michelle, American Kleptocracy, is going to be talking with us about prescient, the Pandora Papers, and a look at how money is flowing and impacting the United States, how wealthy people hide their money. And you know what I found, Nick? A 2006 column from the National Interest that I wrote, Billionaires Without Borders, that talked about this issue in 2006. So I just want to say we were ahead of the game in 2006, talking about money and the way money flows. And I think that we shouldn't forget about that. I know today the new figures on inflation came out. It's been the highest in 40 years. I know I'm feeling it. I think you're probably feeling it. We'll talk to Judah about how that looks and what the impact is around the world in a second. But I think that that's one of the most important story that is was big and forgotten in 3 seconds from 2021 that we're going to bring back in a couple of weeks in our book talk. So please watch this space to sign up. I don't know if you have a 2021 story that you feel has been neglected, Nick, that we need to talk about in 2022. Do you?
Not really. I think that more it's just the sense of, as you said, it's a groundhog year, and things that were not resolved in 2021 are spilling over into 2022, including the dark side of globalization, which I know that Judah will also be addressing as well, and paying attention to changes in narrative and how we're viewing the world.
And let's go to Judah now. Welcome back to the Doorstep, Judah. Thanks so much for coming in and helping us understand what's going on with the world.
Thanks so much for having me. I feel it's a real honor to be the first guest of the year and to have this responsibility to sort of go out on a limb and make some predictions. We'll see. I feel like I did pretty good last year.
Let's see. I'm going to remind everybody of your predictions. So we had our aha. What is our aha for the year? And I think there were some people who were optimistic, and some, myself, and some people who were a little more pessimistic, Nick. But Judah, you said, you talked a lot about that there was a real opportunity for the U.S. to engage in the world at the beginning of last year. Do you think that promise has been fulfilled? And I asked this specifically because the World Politics Review today had this question: how do we preserve Washington's global leadership role at a time when its model of governance is increasingly called into question? So
that's actually from the column that I wrote on Monday. So I guess the easy answer is that engaged in the world is sort of value neutral, right? So clearly, I think that the Biden team has very much engaged in the world. That seems to me, they've had I'd say a much more proactive and active first year in office than I anticipated. And I think they did do well to take some months in the beginning to sort of re-engage, reopen channels of communication and things like that with partners, to take the measure of adversaries and rivals. So I think there was a sort of a moment of, if not hesitation, then reflection, which I think some people were impatient with, because after the 4 years of Trump, there was this sense of we have to get going right away. I felt like that was relatively prudent. And then I feel like there was an initial round of diplomacy with allies that was pretty productive in terms of smoothing over some of the rough edges that had been left by the Trump administration. The initial diplomacy with Russia as well, I felt was again prudent, trying to essentially establish the frameworks of what the Biden team was hoping for and expecting, but also where its red lines might be. So I thought that was effective. I was a little surprised, I'd say, by the time it took to engage with China. In terms of the leadership level, there was that first very rocky and volatile meeting in Alaska, which I think sort of caused some sparks and had a lot of people, I guess, expecting the worst. I don't think we quite had the worst. I don't think, I feel like the Biden team, perhaps they didn't have the choice, but took longer than I expected to get to the leader level summit, which we saw more recently. And I guess also some of those Trump era sanctions and or rather trade tariffs and things like that really haven't even been begun to be addressed. So I think that was the big the surprise for me. I think something that a lot of people were surprised by, but myself less so, because of the time I've spent in Europe and keeping a close eye on transatlantic relations, was some of the bumps in the road in terms of transatlantic relations. I think there was an expectation, definitely in Europe, and I think in the sort of Atlanticist community on both sides of the pond, that there would just be not just a honeymoon, but an extended period of cooperation and smooth communication and a real reparation of the damage that Trump did. My feeling is that that was always a little unrealistic because of the depth and the breadth of some of the differences in transatlantic policymaking. And that there's always this sense of, especially with Democratic presidents, finally someone who likes us, finally someone who appreciates us, who appreciates our way of doing things, multilateralism, diplomacy, et cetera. And then there's always this big surprise when they realize that the president of the United States is actually the president of the United States. And when US interests take priority, the president will always go after those first. So I think we saw that with AUKUS, for instance, the Afghanistan withdrawal, which I think was a pretty courageous move. And I think the long-term wise one, even though there have been some awful humanitarian consequences from it. I guess to wrap up, it's sort of a wide range. I think the gaps, I'd say, so far would be, and I think they're trying to address that, would be Southeast Asia would be a prominent gap in terms of, there have been actually some diplomatic movement there and engagement there, so that might be a little unfair, but maybe with less results than maybe one would have expected. The Quad in South Asia and Asia Pacific seems like there's more momentum there. I'd say Latin America and South America in particular, there's been a real absence of urgency. And I think that there are quite a few urgent matters on the table there. And then I think that sadly, as always, Africa takes a back seat, and I think wrongly so, because of how much exciting opportunities there are there, how much upside potential there is, and how critical it's becoming in terms of the global economy, in terms of the future demographically, in terms of demographic dynamics and things like that. So I think that's a real missed opportunity, but it's a historic one for the US. So I guess that would be my sort of round the globe summing up. But I do think it was a very active year. And I think, especially given the institutional damage done by the Trump administration to the State Department in particular, and a lot of the blockages on nominations for ambassadors and high-level positions, I think they've done a pretty good job. There's never going to be 100% error-free U.S. foreign policy, but I think they've done a pretty good job. And where they might have stepped on some toes or ruffled some feathers, they did a good job to try to step back in real quick and try to address it. I'm thinking in particular with France.
That is very optimistic. Now I'm going to go to you, Nick, because last year you said there might be some unintended consequences, and you thought that the U.S. engaging in the world without thought or going too fast would leave an opportunity for something bad to happen. Do you think something bad has happened, Nick? Is this Kazakhstan, Ukraine invasion the bad thing that's happened, or were you wrong?
I probably was, and thank God that some of the things that could have gone wrong last year didn't in the wake that they could have. But I do think that, and I would agree with Judah here, right? The administration came out, they re-engaged, but there are problems, and one of them is structural and domestically structural, and that is that the Biden administration came in with the impact of the assault on the Capitol, and that still has long-term implications. How that went down, the sense that American politics are unstable, the inability to get some key pieces of legislation through, even when the president and his party control both houses of Congress, meant that on a variety of areas, great rhetoric. President goes to the Glasgow summit. President talks about engaging in the Indo-Pacific, and yet the sense that the Biden administration can only work around the margins. They can't get major things through Congress. They're not going to get a trade deal through Congress. So, Secretary Raimondo has to try to work the margins at the Commerce Department. I think this will have longer term implications. And the sense, too, that the Biden administration, I think, has people in it. And we've talked about this, Judah, with you. We've talked about it with other guests at the Doorstep, and it's been part of our Twitter conversation as well with people of a mindset in the administration that is still not grappling with the diffusion of power. Colin Dueck last year came on and said something which I think is still true. The idea that you can make a declaratory statement and somehow that declaratory statement substitutes for policy action. Dealing with the reality that Russia and China are not going to easily align with U.S. preferences, and that the U.S. ability to compel is not what it once was. I think that this is leading to some issues. So that's the structural. The structural question is within the U.S., and then the geopolitical one is the diffusion of power elsewhere. And the sense then, when these two things come together, that even allies and partners are going to hedge against what they see as disruption. And maybe Judah, since you're in Europe, we're having these talks, the U.S. bilateral talks with Russia, Russia meeting with NATO, Russia meeting as part of the OSCE, significantly the European Union left out on the sideline, but also a sense among at least some Europeans that U.S. policy towards Russia is not in alignment with some of Europe's doorstep interests. And again, you're in Europe right now. I don't know if if you're anticipating major rises to your energy and power bills or anything like that, but that certainly is an area of divergence. So you've talked, Judah, about the first year they came out of the gate, they were saying the right things, they were dealing with ruffled feathers. do you still have that optimism moving forward that in year two of the Biden-Harris administration, they're going to continue to do this, or do you see some real points of disjuncture opening up, whether over Ukraine, NATO, energy, Europe's relationship with China and how that fits in, the other partners in China, around China, worried about U.S. commitments? Anything that, any clouds on the horizon, or do you think that they're going to be able to, be able to navigate these seas?
Well, I have to say, I'm kind of reassured to hear that I'm the voice of optimism, because I tend to be a maybe not pessimistic person, but I'm not necessarily surprised by bad developments. They're perfectly compatible with my worldview. Let's put it that way. I would definitely agree with the guest who you mentioned, whose name I didn't retain.
Oh, Colin Dueck, yeah.
Yeah, that it's one of the things that that bugs me the most about the U.S. foreign policy establishment, whether in government, but also in the sort of ecosystem surrounding government. There's this sort of expectation or understanding that once you frame a problem and once you articulate a solution that makes perfect rational sense to an observer sitting in Washington, D.C. usually, but even, for instance, for sake of argument, that makes sense in terms of a non-zero sum game, that solves the problem. And that at that point, all you have to do is convince everyone that we know their best interests better than they do. And it disregards point of view. It disregards a strategic point of view, which grows out of history, it grows out of experience, it grows out of social and cultural long currents of history, and political history and international politics and things of that nature. It also disregards the non-rational aspects of human behavior, which somehow there's this expectation that won't filter into decision-making in terms of international politics. And to me, that's absolutely absurd. The example I always go back to is Brexit, where you had on one side of the argument, very rational technocratic arguments for why staying in the European Union was in the best interests of everyday Britons. And on the other side, you had a really affect-laden, emotional argument toward national sovereignty and a history of national glory, a lost glory narrative that appealed. And people were, I think, probably, there was a certain attempt to sell Brexit that it would pay off dividends. I tend to have more respect for people's intelligence than that. And I think that people knew that they were going to pay a cost, but it was a cost they were willing to pay. So people are willing to accept net loss outcomes, which is what I wrote in my column on Monday. Yeah. If the emotional payoff is satisfying, I think that's something we're seeing more and more in international politics after a period of sort of cold, emotionless, technocratic governance. I think Trump was a culmination, a cause and a symptom of that. And I think that January 6th, 2020 was almost a paroxysm of that. In the United States, but we've seen it all over the world. So with regard to your question, Nick, in terms of clouds on the horizon, I think that for one thing, the difficulties in harmonizing the transatlantic positions on China, on Russia, on Nord Stream 2 with Russia with regard to Germany, between Eastern and Western Europe, between Northern and Southern Europe, even on Afghanistan for that matter. Those are foreseeable, they're almost inevitable. And they're a fixture of the landscape. They're a feature, not a bug. And so I think that will just always take management on the part of the US, because I think the US is still, and we see it in terms of the negotiations with Russia right now, or the discussions with Russia, that the US is the leader of that coalition and will be. The European Union is not going to be the leader, and no individual European country or format. The Minsk format is not going to step in. It's not going to take the place of U.S. leadership on that. So I think that requires a lot of reflection and puts a lot of responsibility on the United States. And then you have China, same thing. A little different because there's not the same historical aspect in terms of the European security architecture and Europe's relationship to China and to Asia. But that harmonizing that is going to be a constant struggle, a constant effort, if it's at all possible. I think that China is doing a lot of the United States work for it right now because perceptions of China are just going through the floor pretty much around the world and in Europe in particular, where you have countries like France, for instance, which even a few years ago was still talking about China as a potential partner and cooperation where possible, things like that. Popular perception and elite perception of China is now predominantly negative. So China has really done a great service to the goal of creating a coalition. The thing I think where I would maybe speak to and meet your concerns, Nick, are that, and it sort of ties it all together. I feel like there's a real, sort of loss of strategic fluency in the US policymaking establishment. The idea that the adversary gets a say, the idea that there are inflection points and there are momentum points where things shift, where you go from the defensive to the offensive. And I think it works both in negative ways, both when the US foreign policy making community becomes overconfident or over-alarmed. And I'll give a particular example because Russia to me seems like the particular example. Over the past 7 years especially, there's been this sense of fear and alarm about Russia, Russia's resurgence. Russia's replacing us in the Middle East. Russia's moving into Africa. We're about to run a piece today on a more realistic appraisal about Russia's role in Africa. Russia is, going to roll through the post-Soviet space and reestablish its sphere of influence. Maybe. The problem is that that Russia's neither just a gas station with nuclear weapons, nor is it some sort of behemoth hegemonic steamroller that's going to replace the United States. It has a lot of internal problems. It's fairly easy to play a spoiler role when you're dealing with a global power like the United States, and you can go in on its coattails. No one's counting on Russia to protect them in the Middle East. No one's counting on Russia to sort of guarantee a regional security order, whether in Europe or in the Middle East or in Asia. So it's easy to go in and pick off some loose parts here and there, and to step in to find to have preponderant power in a local environment. That's relatively easy, and it's something I think Putin has been good at, and I think the Russian military has proven. I was somewhat skeptical at the beginning of the Syria operation. The Russian military has proven it can project force, it's smart, it has a good doctrine, strategic doctrine, tactical, operational, you name it. Is Putin a strategic genius? Well, we'll see. I personally think it would be a disaster for him to invade Ukraine. Will he do it? Maybe. I thought it would be a disaster for the US to invade Iraq, and we did. It's very easy to fall into that sort of hubris. And so I think that's where the US alarm over Russia starts playing to our disadvantage as well. Basically, my reading of it is that Russia has played a defensive position really well. They've now achieved a certain a state of stalemate, if you like. I think China probably has as well, where, like you said, we can't compel. Yeah. We might not even be able to deter. But should Russia invade Ukraine, that's a real inflection point where from the defensive, and this is straight out of Clausewitz and classic strategic theory, the passage from the defensive to the offensive is a dangerous point because it's where your compressed force and your compressed momentum and dynamic momentum starts extending outward. And as we know, when a coiled spring springs out, it has a lot of force, and then it reaches its apogee. And that's where it loses its power. And I think it's a real open question, especially given all the instability right now, and we could talk about that in the post-Soviet space, whether Russia has the resources to stabilize Kazakhstan, shore up Belarus, intervene in Armenia if necessary, and try to hold Azerbaijan and Turkey, keep them honest in that theater, and commit, what are we talking about, 100, 120,000, maybe more troops to invading and occupying and holding territory in Ukraine, which I would say is a much more capable military right now than Saddam Hussein's, for instance, and with a lot more friendly neighbors willing to channel support and aid, and with a lot more repercussions on the economic side than the US ever faced from Iraq, from the Iraq invasion. So again, it's just all a way of saying the adversary gets a say. The US will have enduring challenges and pitfalls to avoid in trying to advance its interests. But having said all that, so does China, so does Russia. And I think we are definitely entering into a period where they will more and more try to challenge the United States, try to test the United States' resolve on core interests. And I think if I have one real sort of major concern for 2022, it would be whether the taboo against interstate warfare for conquest holds or not. And I'm concerned about that. And even if it were, for instance, in the realm of a cyber attack that passes more clearly than we've seen in the past into a real act of warfare with the kind of impact that we understand as being bellicose and an act of war. That I think these next 12 months, for me, that's where the biggest danger is. And even there, again, that might then reinforce that taboo. It might reinforce a backlash. We don't know. But I think if I have a more pessimistic or alarmed concern, that would be it right there. So I guess clouds on the horizon, certainly Ukraine is one. A massive cyber attack that sort of we all know what it will look like. We all know theoretically what it will look like, but I think that kind of shocked but not surprised event in cyber warfare could very well take place in the next 12 months. So those would be my areas of concern with regard to US foreign policy, but global politics in general.
Yeah.
I have to step in here. Neither one of you have mentioned that this is like Groundhog year. No, you have not used the word pandemic, and the fact that we're all still stuck. Well, I don't know if you are, Judah, but we're stuck here with now booster mandates, mask mandates, kids walking out in New York City of school in protest of in-person classes. How does that
Stuyvesant and Brooklyn Tech? We have to specify. My brother went to Stuyvesant, and I know a lot of people who went to Brooklyn Tech. So these are sort of elite schools in New York that with precocious, shall we say, politically inclined students.
Well, it all starts at a local level, and where it starts, it can spread. That's what I believe. But where does the pandemic fit in all of this? At the end of the day, here at the Doorstep, we look at how do we on the ground, average Main Street USA person view the world. And I don't know that we're actually thinking of all the issues we've talked about. We're thinking of inflation. Right. I can't buy what I want to buy. I can't go outside. That's really annoying. It's hard for me to care about Ukraine. I'm saying it as a hypothetical. I am Ukrainian. Disclosure. I care about Ukraine, but I do I do think there's a sense of Groundhog Day, and an issue that I do want to ask you too about for seriously is this idea that I'm seeing the number one issue of my students is their mental health.
Right.
I don't know how that fits into foreign policy, but it's got to somehow impact discussions of who we are as Americans and who we are in the world.
Well, it reminds me of, I'm dating myself, but I'm pretty sure you'll both get the reference, but it reminds me of Airplane. I feel like the Biden administration picked a tough year to embrace a foreign policy for the middle class.
Yeah.
Yeah, for all those reasons, whether supply chain difficulties, the pandemic, energy prices. It's a tough sell right now to go back to the American people and say, look, everything we've been doing outside the US, look how well it's paid off for you. And
Yeah.
Nick, one of the most recent pieces you wrote for World Politics Review had to do with the Biden administration's the circle that it would not be able to square between fuel prices at the pump, climate change and the green transition, and containing Russia's energy and geopolitical designs. So I think that does play in quite a bit with it. I'll be honest, in the UK, I feel like I've been very fortunate. I've been in a part of the UK that has always been about 2 or 3 weeks behind London in terms of the pandemic curve. And because the government always waited 2 or 3 weeks too long to impose restrictions on London, they were always perfectly timed for where I am, which is Newcastle. So the pandemic has had, in terms of human costs, in terms of the healthcare system, and in terms of day-to-day life, there was never a sort of panicked approach to the restrictions. There was never, people generally did not mask up outdoors, which we now know is relatively sensible. Things have remained that way now. I feel like we are transitioning into a live with COVID reality, for better and worse. I don't think, given the explosiveness, the explosive contagiousness of the Omicron variant, and the fact that whether or not the data backs this up, the perception is that it's less severe. It seems to be backing, the data does seem to be backing that up for now. I just don't think you're going to be able to sell to publics anymore the kind of sacrifices and pain that was absorbed throughout last year. I guess with regard to what you mentioned about your students, Tatiana, this kind of gets into another thing another aspect that I think is going to be central to international politics this year and moving forward. It's the topic of a column, a weekly column that we've started in the past 6 months or so, or maybe more recently, by Aishwarya Machani, on intergenerational equity and justice. The burden that's been placed on young people in the past year, and the sacrifices that we've asked them to make to protect more vulnerable people from a virus that we know statistically did not threaten them as much as it did vulnerable people and older people, have been enormous. And I feel like we missed a real opportunity after the global financial crisis to address some of those costs of that crisis, to address some of the younger generation's concerns. I think that has had ripple effects in the Occupy movements and the backlash to that, and things of that nature. And I think that if we don't address those issues this time, we'll find a real cleavage in societies that will only exacerbate the kind of cleavages that we're seeing in Western democracies and elsewhere now. We're talking about aging societies that will depend on young people for their Social Security and retirement safety nets, and a diminishing proportion of young people who have had their earning potential severely hampered and undermined, not to mention their developmental process of entering young adulthood. So I think that for that reason, we felt it was really important to include a voice from that generation, and to really center and foreground some of those concerns and some of those those preoccupations. And so I think that with regard to mental health, with regard to education, with regard to employment, that to me, as much as the two things coming out of the pandemic, or three things, let's say, that I think are primordial, are something that has gotten, I think, more attention, which is gender equality and the need to build back better by including women's voices in rebuilding after the pandemic, and repairing some of the damage that was disproportionately felt by women during the pandemic. Global equity in terms of vaccine equity, healthcare equity, with the global South, Africa in particular. And then finally, intergenerational equity. We don't take enough into account the concerns and the needs of the young generation that's alive now and the generations that are to come that haven't been born yet. And that's as much as important with the pandemic as with climate change, for instance. So I think those are the major challenges that I see for the pandemic. As for the rest, I'm pretty sanguine about human resilience and the ability of societies and the international system to sort of shore up some of the fault lines that appeared. It might be too optimistic about that, but I am. But those three things I think are really, really crucial.
I agree, and I am optimistic. I'm gonna, before Nick pessimistic voice. I'm looking to Chile and the election there of the left-wing legislator who came out of nowhere. He takes office in March. So I'm going to be really watching what's happening there, because I do think that we're not watching Latin America enough. And, there were huge evangelical movements there that put a lot of conservatives in power. But I think 2022. I think the tide is turning. And I do think that younger generation, as I said last year, is kind of coming up and understanding how they need to participate in politics. So not just protest, but politics. So I'm looking forward to our 2022 midterms here. Beto O'Rourke is running again in Texas for governor. So I think that's going to be an interesting, exciting race here in the US, considering everything that's happening in Texas. So I'm optimistic that from the ground up, from those students walking out of the classroom, that there's going to be some changes. And now, Nick, you wanted to be pessimistic?
Well, of course I want to be pessimistic.
Your reputation precedes you.
Precedes me, yeah, well, of course. Look, I think going back to the question of the pandemic, and first of all, is the negative impacts the pandemic is having on politics, particularly in the industrialized democracies. The restrictions, the almost sometimes pandemic health theater in terms of restrictions and everything else fuels a backlash. We already saw how this played out in schools in Virginia, in the Virginia gubernatorial race. I think it's going to be a disruptive element. I think this is something, by the way, that other countries, I think, have priced in the fact that they expect that President Biden will lose one or both houses of Congress in 2022. And that a lot of huffing and puffing from the administration about things that they're going to do or not do will be impacted by the loss there. I think people are beginning to realize that far from 2020 being a decisive break in American politics, the prospect of either a return of Donald Trump to the White House, or if not Trump himself, a Trump allied figure, is something that I think particularly Europeans are beginning to really take notice of, that this is a possibility, and therefore that hedging aspect. Tatiana, the point about mental health, I think, is really interesting, because this also comes, as we discussed in the last podcast for last year. We just had the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Soviet Union, and you compare and contrast the wave of optimism among young people in 1991, even with the recession and all of that, the sense the Cold War was over. We were on the cusp of these major new technological breakthroughs that over the past 30 years have transformed everything, the way we live, the way we communicate, the way we work. And I think that generation coming out in 2021 is looking at this pandemic and what's the next pandemic, what's the next health security issue. Technology is perhaps seen in a more negative way. Judah, you already talked about cyber. One of the things we've just put out on our Doorstep Twitter feed is a link to a commentary about, the next cyber war is not going to necessarily just be big ticket items, but the extent to which everything in your home is linked in, and that, cyber war could come down and touch you right in the home where you live. And so I think this, and as you said, the sense that politics don't work, that the structures of the last 30 years, business structures, economic structures are not delivering. This really, I think, opens up the possibility of upheaval, institutional upheaval, changes in the landscape. But this sense, I think, of pessimism, which just isn't me, I think is shared by others, that we're entering into an era where things are a lot more uncertain. And how that's going to play out, I think, is going to be critical. My worry, again, with the Biden administration, and it's not a knock on the president in the sense of his age, but yes, his age and generation matters. And I don't know intellectually if he and some of the people around him grasp some of these intergenerational issues the way, Judah, you've put it out there, and how this will have an impact on politics, and the agility that you need to shape, that the world is changing and needing to shape to it. And as you said, maybe not an auspicious year for foreign policy for the middle class, but increasingly that's going to be, I think, a driving factor, not just in the US, but in Britain, in other countries, in Europe, and in East Asia, of how does what happens in the world benefit me? And don't talk to me about grand systemic vision. I want to know how I'm going to get a job, I'm going to put food on the table, how I make sure the heat is on in wintertime, and that I have opportunities. So I think all of this comes together. And again, I'm pessimistic about the short-term prospects in the US. You're in Britain. What happens with how much longer does Boris Johnson remain as prime minister? We have an uncertain election in France. The coalition in Germany looks to me to be far more unstable, perhaps, than people are willing to give it credit. How long that coalition endures, and as we've seen in other places, Russia is very much an unpredictable wild card these days. And what's going to happen? Not only what Russia does internationally, but domestically. And China itself is going through some real points of divergence. So if either of you want to talk me off the pessimistic ledge, I'm open to being convinced. But
I'll take a stab. I'll take a stab at it. I feel like there's a cognitive fallacy, I think it's called, where the here and now fallacy, maybe.
Yeah.
When I think back to the late 80s, for instance, and I think of what the mid 80s and growing up under the threat of nuclear war in New York, knowing that, New York isn't Newcastle. It was definitely targeted by a number of warheads. There was no way that a nuclear war between the US and Russia could break out and my city would survive.
Yeah.
And so I think, I think every and then my father, to just share a little bit of my family's background and his, was a hidden child during World War II. His father left Poland after the pogroms in the mid 1920s. And I think all of our families have these stories, and every generation has, there's before that, or the Depression and World War II, and we could go further and further back. And I think that a lot of what we're seeing now in terms of some of the social justice movements addressing some of the even longer cycles of systemic injustices and things like that. So I think that there's always this sense of what we're facing now is the worst it's ever been. I'm not quite convinced that the United States in 2022 is more politically divided than it was in 1968 or 1972, for that matter. And so, you know, when you look at, you know, there was political violence, there was terrorist bombings throughout maybe not throughout the U.S., but in the U.S., the Weather Underground, and others. In Europe, there were the Red Brigades, Red Brigades in Italy, and the Baader Meinhof gang in Germany, Northern Ireland, the Basques, the ETA, you name it. I mean, so it's very easy to lose sight of the fact that the world is always coming to an end.
Yeah.
And very often that's a personal anxiety because our lives are, you know, are cyclical. I feel like with young people, I think in particular with young people, a lot of the anxiety that they're feeling, I think, is cultural and societal. And I think maybe less that there's a lot going on that even absent the pandemic. My wife teaches at the university here, and she's often expressed the fact that she feels like there's a lot more a sense of anxiety among young people about the world and their place in it than she remembers or than I remember. So I think that is something that is not necessarily that can be independent of some of these other things we're talking about. That doesn't make it any less important, but it is somewhat independent. And so what does that mean? I think for me, I'm always trying to, I guess, keep an eye out for where that green shoot is going to break through the permafrost. You know, we have a lot of closure in the world. I wrote about this in my year-end essay. Yeah. That closure has become almost the default mental setting. There's a crisis somewhere, close the borders. New variant, close the borders. Trade competition, close the borders. And it reflects, I think, even within countries, there's a closure to listening to the other side of the argument, to differing points of view. There's a closure to other groups, to others. And so I think that's a pendulum swing. There's no way, I think we made a lot of mistakes in terms of how we practiced globalization. Because the narrative was a lovely one. It was a very inspiring and compelling one. And we blew it because a lot of wealth went into very few pockets, and it could have been more evenly distributed. And I think that would have made a big difference. But that narrative of a zero-sum game and where we can all get along and share pieces of a ever bigger pie, I think that we can't go back to that. That's gone. Yeah. But what will be the new narrative that emerges, that gives us a sense of, oh, you know what, there are benefits to crossing frontiers, to opening frontiers, to letting people in, and because then we can go there, to try to understand beyond the divides of the political elites, maybe a person to person and people to people exchanges, things like that. So I'm always keeping my eye out for that. I think young people historically always play a big role in that. And that's sort of where the optimist in me will be looking at the same time. I'm kind of like a George Carlin optimist in the sense that, you know, I think the planet will be fine. You know, we might not be around to see it, but the planet will be fine. So in the very long term, things are going to work out. The challenge that we have is to make sure that as widely as possible we can try to sort of build some sort of narrative and hope for a better collective future, because, you know, we all know we all know that the boundaries and the borders are artificially created. And so where that narrative comes from, I don't know, but I never rule it out. I think I think the pessimism is as arbitrary and non-rational and not indefendable as optimism is. Neither can be ruled out. So I'm expecting, hoping for the best and expecting the worst, or preparing for the worst anyway.
On that note, don't look up. Did you see the movie? Don't look up.
I haven't seen it, no, but I'll check. I've read a lot about it already.
Thank you so much for your time today. This was really great. And hopefully we can have you back to see what went well and what didn't in 2023.
Yeah.
Make it a yearly tradition. I
Make
love
it a yearly tradition. Exactly.
Okay, I'll book it in right now. In ink. Thank you both so much for having me. It's
Yeah,
been a great pleasure. A
Thanks,
lot of fun.
Judith.
Thanks for listening to The Doorstep, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs. For more, go to carnegiecouncil.org. Stay healthy and safe.